There's two parts or two components to my presentation this afternoon. One is around growing new Kauri resources, and the other is using that production focus to look at the potential to identify resistance and to take that resistance, if we can find it, out into the wider landscape. I think it's useful to go back, despite what we've heard already today, some of the information that Bruce Burns gave us about the current Kauri forest, its extent and some of the secondary regrowth that has occurred since the early logging days. We've heard the figure of about 1 to 3% as being the resource that's still available from the original Kauri forestry cover that existed particularly when Europeans arrived. If you take the various estimates of 1 million to 1.5 million hectares of what was described as Kauri forest, if we say that there's 6,500 to 7,500 hectares, it's actually probably a worse figure than the 1 to 3%. It's probably more like we have about 0.5% of what we used to have. So that's a fairly bad position to be in when you've got now on top of that diseases that are threatening, whether they be native diseases or whether they are introduced exotic diseases. A dead tree is a dead tree. We do have 60,000 hectares of second growth forest that came up on what was supposed to be rural or agricultural land cleared of original forest, found to be unproductive as a forestry or as an agricultural area, quickly reverted back to a Kauri resource, usually under a manuka cover, but they tend to be on atypical sites and difficult sites. So they tend to be on ridge tops and dry ridge crests and areas where perhaps if agriculture wasn't so good, then possibly tree growth wasn't going to be so good either. But if you go back to those numbers again, 6,500 hectares and 60,000 hectares, they tend to be sites where we perhaps wouldn't have put a forestry operation. So what does that say about the trees that the forestry people left behind? Are we dealing with a selected worst of the worst from one particular aspect of the tree, or are there other components about that tree, those trees, that might make them a little bit more useful in the future for some other purposes? One thing we don't know about these resources is what is their diversity, and we talk about diversity in a genetic sense. How closely related are they? What's the interaction between these isolated populations? And are they potentially at risk because of the way that they are comprised? If you look down at the bottom on the map here, when we talk about natural distribution of the species, we are talking about current natural distribution. This is not where the green zone on the map is not where Kauri has always been. The red star down the bottom is one of the furthest southern records of Kauri in the coal records around Roxburgh and Mataura in Southland. So the species has moved up and down the country over time as climate and glaciation has allowed. So when we say natural distribution, we mean current. What have humans observed, and where have they seen the species? We've heard previously today about the way that Kauri was used to develop an early economy for New Zealand, and there is an ongoing interest in the species in that sense. You only have to look at the price of buried Kauri material coming out of the far north, and the prices that are being achieved for 40,000-year-old timber from buried swampland. And that's been pushing over the last 20, 30 years an interest in growing the species in plantation. Now the image that you see there is of one of the fastest growing stands that we have observed at Te Puna, just north of Tauranga. A planting put in by a local farmer on a nice piece of ground. It used to be a kiwi fruit orchard. Those trees are at age 14. And the first of them at that age were already 30 centimetres in diameter. Now, what we typically think of with our native species, if we if we go and buy something at $10 or $15 a seedling from our local garden centre, we plant it, and we come back in 5 years' time, it's still alive, well, hooray. Perhaps it hasn't grown, but we didn't really expect it to anyway. But these sort of images and these sort of stands that the Forest Service put in, as John says, through the 1950s around the country, we are finding much better growth rates than anybody has ever expected. This stand here, growing at sustained 2 centimetres in diameter a year, and at times was 2 metres in height a year. Now, the farmer has done nothing special. He knows nothing about where that stock came from, other than he bought it from his local tree grower. The first crop died, he replaced it with another lot that came from somewhere else, and they've done this. So this is the potential that sits out there with some of our species, and with Kauri in particular. It could grow in a wide range of sites, and I'll show you a map in a moment, and it grows well outside what we call the current natural range. And it's also, when it's outside that natural range, it's also now regenerating and producing seedlings in those planted stands in Taranaki, in Hawke's Bay, down in Wellington, and we see viable seed being produced much further south than that. As we talk to forestry interests, and particularly Māori forestry interests, through Taitokoto, we are finding an interest in growing this species for production. Another means by which Māori landowners can re-engage with the species and to look at developing themselves, the land, and the cultural aspects that go with it. So there are a number of reasons why Kauri may become more of a species of interest in the future to forest growers. One of the reasons that we are pursuing the species, the picture that was just on the screen, but when we compare planted Kauri to natural Kauri stands, we find a very different growth pattern and productivity pattern. What you're looking here at is the amount of timber being produced per hectare from various stands, and what you see with the red line is a typical median natural stand of Kauri, the likes of the Hunua Ranges, Waitanoe at Katikati, Russell Forest, all those sorts of places. When you average it out, that's what the red line looks at, hardly much before 50 years of age. When you compare that with the average planted stand, that's about 12 times more productivity, just from taking it from up in the uplands down onto more fertile lands. Most of the planted stands were below 300 metres in elevation. A lot of the natural stands were slightly higher than 300 metres. So you're looking at different landscapes, different soils, different climate conditions. What our colleagues in New Caledonia tell us is that if we put one breeding cycle, that's selecting parents and selecting better producing trees, we can dramatically increase the productivity without necessarily affecting the wood quality. So there is an economic driver starting to appear in the story about Kauri. So can production plantings then act as a backup to the conservation efforts that are going on with the species? If there's an economic driver, then PTA becomes an economic issue rather than just solely a conservation issue. Now, in the current political and economic climate, which is the one that's going to be the easiest to get money from government for? Is it for conservation or is it for economics? I'll leave you to answer that question yourselves. But this map shows you the location of the planted and natural stands that we used to construct the graph that you saw before. So we've got planted stands up around here, and right here, just on the north side of the Maungatauniwha Ranges, down through to the Hawke's Bay, out here on the East Cape, Hawara, Taranaki, and those with very good eyes, just above the red arrow, there's one down here on the Taieri Plains, just south of Dunedin. If you graph that stand number 25 against stand number 1 here, just south of Kaitaia, their growth rates and productivity are almost identical. And when you consider that the red arrow, or the red star on one of my first images showed where Kauri was found in the coal records in Southland, the soils and perhaps some of the climate are all familiar to the species. So we're not necessarily, with our production plantings, pushing the species to somewhere where it's completely out of its range, or out of its home territory. And if you look then, let's say these are the second growth stands, the ones that are named. So if we go in from the production side, but using production as a means of increasing productivity from these stands, increasing productivity also implies maintaining productivity. So we are looking at a typical or classic breeding approach, but there are a number of important features to Kauri as we move into this breeding space. And some of it Bruce has already mentioned, but it has implications for what we might want to do with the species, or might try and do with the species in terms of its health and its economic potential. It's monoecious, so that's the male and the female naughty bits of the plant sitting there on the same plant, often in very close proximity. This cone, if it was off a tree from today, this would be a cone that would be becoming mature around February next year. It's already been pollinated, the seed is developing inside that. The smaller cones up here will have just been pollinated by these male cones, and in close proximity like this, there is the opportunity for the tree to self-pollinate. Now, in terms of tree health, that's one of the worst possible scenarios. To maintain diversity or to increase diversity, you want the pollen that enters these small receptive female cones to come from as wide possible source as possible. Now, the other important component to this is that when that seed falls, it tends to fall and stay within, in most situations, about 150 metres of the parent tree. So you've got the opportunity for parents and children to be very closely associated, and with the population that we as humans have created, then the chance for the pollen that is producing seed in these stands to come from related or very closely related individuals is quite high. So that means then that potentially that the individuals within these populations are very closely related, and that's a worst case scenario. Now, if we look at some of these classic images that we see from the Waitakeres and Huia, we see isolated pockets of disease and diseased trees affecting the health of the forest and the ecosystem. And under those thinning canopies that Ian has shown us, and this is an image from Huia where we have Phytophthora active, we also find almost right next to infected trees, we find regeneration. And these seedlings, these Kauri seedlings, could be anything up to 5 or 7 years old. So they've germinated and they've persisted while apparently there is active Phytophthora on the site. So can we see, or are we seeing, resistance to the disease in this next generation of seedlings? Could there have been twice as many, 10 times as many seedlings, but the other susceptible seedlings have already disappeared? These are questions, they're not answers, these are just questions at the moment. So if there is resistance, are these seedlings displaying it? And can we start to look for a wider set of resistance throughout the population? So how do we do it? Well, the easy part perhaps is collecting seed and growing it and testing those seedlings and challenging those seedlings with Phytophthora. But before that, there's a whole range of activities and engagements that need to occur because when we look at these stands, the Waiparas, Trouncin, the Ngātonga Scenic Reserve here, Great Barrier, Waitanohe, these are all owned by somebody. Somebody owns that resource, and we have to engage with them to get permission, to get access, to then start to discuss issues like IP and ownership and what can be done with that information, and where does that information go and who benefits from it, and all that sort of process. And that's it's a long process, but if we want to do it properly, then that's what we have to do. So what we would look to do is to engage with DOC and with iwi and say, this is the sort of area that we would like to test, because we would like to see, particularly from Waipawa there, the arrow seems to have disappeared for a while, up here, Waipawa is one of the largest remnants of mature forest. Is a great place to start with, because the progeny have been sent around so far. What's the resistance like in that provenance? Is it different from Pukekaroro, the yellow line? Is it different from the blue line off Great Barrier Island? Is it different from Waitanohe, Katikati? And what are the implications for that for moving species around, as we have done over time? If we can find differences, and we see differences in the growth and the performance and how they function in the nursery, then that may say that we can see, perhaps that may implicate that there's differences in disease resistance as well, some of the other characteristics that you can't see on the outside of the tree initially. There's this concern that in the last glaciation that Kauri was pushed all the way up to the likes of Te Paki in the north. If that's the case, then some of the early work around DNA or a look at a glimpse at the diversity within the species suggests that it could almost be clonal. Now, we don't know that, but some of that issue is already starting to raise, so that if it likes one, the Phytophthora likes one population, it may like them all. So we need to quickly find these sort of answers out. So let's see about getting hold of large amounts of seed from widely dispersed populations, testing it for resistance, testing it for its production potential, perhaps breed resistant clones and deploy them. And when we look at the opportunity to grow Kauri outside the current natural range, then maybe in negotiation with iwi, with the people who own the trees, people who own land beyond the current natural range, who can host those populations, whilst we do all the other stuff that Ian's doing and other people are doing about trying to get rid of or control the Phytophthora, take it to safe locations, keep the diversity, try and use production to help pay for that and to drive it and to keep people interested in it, and then hopefully at some stage, if necessary, be then able to take Kauri back to the populations where it used to be and perhaps where it's been removed from. So I think there's an opportunity to go from natural to planted forests that over time may be indistinguishable, and it's a place where production and conservation can mix and mingle and be comfortable partners. These sorts of activities I don't think are absolutely and exclusively separate all the time. This is somewhere where we can mingle. This is, to me, when I went to Huia and Waitakere with Giles and Ian and Peter, and we looked around, and at the beginning of the day I was quite depressed, and at the end of the day I was quite hopeful with what I saw. So I think that the more we talk, the more we get together, the more we are likely to find solutions one way or another. Kia ora, thank you very much.